We're not pivoting. The world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Clarke.
And I'm Rick Gatteau, and today we're exploring a wonderful topic, the topic of romance. We're going to talk about how technology is potentially affecting dating and relationships, and we'll also talk about what romantic competence is, as well as learn more about healthy relationship skills. And we are so thrilled to be joined by Joanne Davila. We've gotten to know you for many years working together. She's the distinguished professor in the Department of Psychology at Stony Brook University. So thank you first, Joanne, for coming in and being part of our podcast today. All right, so let's start with the opening question, and that is, talk about the state of romance in American society today, and maybe even a historical perspective. Where are we with romance today?
Well, romance is certainly alive and well. Relationships are alive and well. People want relationships, and everything we know shows how important relationships are for people's well-being. That said, there's definitely some shifts over time that have been happening. So, for example, one shift is that our marriage rates are down, which is interesting. So some recent statistics show that only about 47% of U.S. households were headed by married couples in 2024, which is a significant decline over about the past 50 years or so, when it was as high as 65% of marriages, of households. Our divorce rates are also down, though, which is interesting. So fewer people are getting married, but fewer people are getting divorced. And so if you look at first marriages, the data used to be that about 50% of first marriages will end in divorce. And now it's about 40%. So it's still high. We still have some concerns there, but that's a pretty significant shift. Now, age at marriage has actually gone up. So people used to get married in their early 20s. Now they're getting married in their late 20s, 30 years old, things like that. So those are pretty big changes. Probably they all kind of relate to each other, right? People are waiting to get married, and so the marriage rates are a little bit down. People are waiting to get married, so they're maybe less likely to get divorced. If you get married later, you probably know yourself better. You have less change that you're going to be making over time, where you might, grow out of a relationship, for example. So it seems that the marriages are sticking more, I guess, is one way to think about that. More people are actually remaining single these days, not surprisingly, given what I just said. And dating rates have gone down. And maybe that's in part due to some of the stress associated with dating, which we can chat about in a little bit if you want to. I think more people are intentionally choosing to stay single. And if you look at the research, for people who do that, when they make the choice, they actually do really well. Some of the data would suggest that people who are married or partnered have better health outcomes, both mental and physical health. But people who intentionally choose to be single do fine also. So
It's good to know.
yeah.
So, and that was interesting how you framed the intentional choice. So I wonder, do we have assumptions about romantic relationships? And I just wonder how they're shaped by society and the media and technology and so on. Can you talk a little bit about our assumptions and things that are kind of redefining what
Yeah.
romance is?
Absolutely. We definitely have assumptions about what romance is, what relationships are, how they should look. This can range from sort of relatively benign things like the wedding industry. The wedding industry tells us how we should have relationships and what they should look like. But then it ranges to things that are less benign, like the porn industry, for people who, particularly young people who may not have a lot of experience. They might think that this is how sex is for everybody, right? And that can be much more problematic in certain ways. So, everything we see, everything we hear in any kind of media, right? Music, movies, social media, TV, right? Look at The Bachelorette, right? Shows like that. Those shape our assumptions about how relationships should go, about how people should behave, about who we should be with, all of this. On the one hand, there's probably some healthy models out there, but there's also a lot of unhealthy models out there as well.
Right.
So in simpler times, I think dating happened. I think someone picked up the telephone and got permission to call to somebody. But today, I just think about the explosion in technology around the dating apps and social media and texting. How has that played a part in the development of romance and relationships?
Yeah, I think it's played a big part, and probably in a whole host of ways. I'll highlight two really briefly. One is that dating plays out much more publicly these days, right? Before it was more private or more quiet, or it could be so if you wanted it to be. Now it's really almost impossible to keep these kinds of things private because of the way we engage with people, online and on text and so forth. And so when things play out publicly, it comes back to the expectations in some ways. People have a lot of expectations and a lot of assumptions, and people want to tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing, and all of that, which can be super stressful for people. There's a lot of social comparison that happens. Why am I not this way, or why isn't this going this way for me, or why is this person doing this other thing? So playing out publicly, I think, is a huge stressor actually. And then it happens way more immediately, and things can move really much more quickly, which also has positive and negatives. So on the one hand, you can find out more about people more quickly and make decisions more quickly, which could be of benefit, right? You don't have to waste a lot of time necessarily. But it also can be problematic in that people can be really impulsive, right? If you're upset about something, you now have many venues to just vent that right away. Whereas before, you might have to wait until somebody answers the phone, or you actually see them in person, or your letter gets delivered. Right now, it's like you could just say and do anything you want really quickly, which can have some pretty negative consequences sometimes.
Can I ask a follow-up? Do you think that the ability, for example, to text makes it easier for people to choose to end a relationship? Are they more willing to enter into a dating scene knowing it's easier to end a relationship using technology than it would have been years ago, where you'd have to actually call the person or see them in person to end that relationship?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I won't say that everybody, does that, but I think what you're describing happens a lot. People are just like, well, I'll just text it and that'll be it. Never have to look the person in the face. Don't have to think about it anymore. Or I could just literally ghost them, right? I could just full ignore, and that's fine. And, it's done. So yeah, there's less accountability, I think.
The other, and you talked a little bit about the dating and how stressful that is. And I think you read a lot of articles, you see a lot of things that have been posted on Facebook and other social media. You see movies, you see and hear songs where it's kind of that blasting out of things that don't necessarily go well, particularly in the early onset of dating when you're still trying to get to know each other, you're still doing the dance, you haven't quite figured out what is kind of the harmony between the two of you. Can you talk a little bit about that patience and letting the relationship evolve and really giving each other grace and not this call out culture?
Yeah. That is part of the work of a relationship. That's part of the work of a healthy relationship, is to take the time and to be patient and to be intentional and to, really evaluate someone's behavior, right? Which we can really only see over time and across situations,
Yeah.
And so, like you said, giving people grace, right? It's important to give some of that. And then it's also important to recognize when it's time to stop, right? And you need the time to be able to do that. So with things happening so quickly and people being sort of immediately, calling things out, I think you can lose some of that. So, yeah, I think that's part of the stressful part of it. Um, so I'm not sure if I answered the
Yeah, and one follow-up of that is because it goes on social media, it stays there.
It stays there.
And so some of the things you may write and, deepen your emotions of anger, frustration, and so on, that person's name is out there with some behavior that you didn't feel was appropriate. And that person has to negotiate that for perpetuity until we can start to expunge the internet, which is certainly not now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that does happen. I mean, it's, people get canceled, right, that way,
Yeah.
and that can happen just in, not necessarily in, for famous people, but
Yeah.
just in our in our communities, in our circles, people get labeled
Yeah.
and then stigmatized and bullied and,
Yeah.
all of those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Right, can we go back to, I was really interested to hear some of the stats you mentioned about divorce rates, marriage rates, and also just people choosing to remain single. Can you share from your research and experience what are the changing gender roles that affect romance and relationships? In particular, I'm curious about being single. Are there differences between men and women who make those choices, and what influences those decisions?
Yeah, I don't know the exact data too well, so I'm just going to preface it with that. What I have seen is that I think there's at least some proportion of men who are single who are not choosing to be single, and that's probably pretty unhealthy for them, and I think they're pretty unhappy about that. I think there's a trend that more women are choosing to remain single. So, gender differences. I was just literally having this conversation with a friend yesterday about gender differences, which I try to stay away from a little bit because even though there are some things that are even, sort of biologically gendered, gender's fluid. So much of how we experience and present with gender is about socialization. So I try to be a little careful about those kinds of things. That said, there certainly are, trends that we see. I would imagine there's the people who are intentionally choosing. Some of them might be doing that because they actually enjoy being single. Some of them might be doing that because they've decided it's too hard actually to navigate a relationship and it's easier for them to be single. That may be coming out along gender lines in some ways, but I can't say for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when we talk about romance and healthy relationship skills, not everybody, but most people are learning that through childhood, through their parents, their village and circle of support, caring teachers, maybe caring neighbors, pets, relationships, and so on. So, how exactly does one develop healthy relationship skills? Where are we seeing it? Where can they find it?
Yeah. That's a really important question because what you said is accurate. People learn about relationships from their own relationships, both immediate, parents, siblings, and the larger community. That doesn't mean they're learning how to have healthy relationships. And they may not even be explicitly learning these things. A lot of it is just happening implicitly. Right? They're sort of soaking up experiences and internalizing those, and those form the foundation for then how they treat others and how they expect to be treated. And for some people who are fortunate, they learn that they should be respected and that they deserve to be treated well, and they learn how to treat people kindly. And for lots of people, they don't learn that, right? They learn that maybe they're not worthy or that others are not to be trusted or, whatever the case may be. So this is, a foundational part of why I do the work I do, because I really think we actually need to teach people how to have healthy relationships because people don't just know. And when I say that, people are like, oh, you're right. No one ever taught me these things. And yet we just assume that it's just something you figure out. You just learn it. It just happens. It absolutely does not just happen.
Mm.
So, yeah. So I've been trying to think about ways that we can actually teach people these kinds of skills.
Very important, even for the college population, too.
Especially.
So let's talk about it from a little different frame because sometimes, you just see someone and there's something about them. It's their look, it's their energy, it's what they represent, and it's physiological. And there's no rationality as to why you just connect with that person. So these are things you don't have control over. So can you talk about what is triggering that desire for romance viscerally from someone that you're just connecting with? You're just vibing with that person.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that happens. That absolutely happens. And, I think there are certainly some biological explanations for that and some evolutionary explanations for that. And yeah, I mean, it's a amazing feeling often when that kind of thing happens. And that's why it's so, uh, draws people in. Does that lead to healthy relationships? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It depends. And, we we shouldn't ignore our attractions and our pull towards people. We shouldn't ignore those things. We have to go with that. And then we have to decide whether the person is really right for us or not. Yeah, that's what I think.
And what's your take on the notion of opposites attract?
Opposites definitely do attract, as so do similar people. So it's not one or the other. All right, we're very fair.
So let's talk about the book that you wrote, which is great. It's called The Thinking Girl's Guide to the Right Guy. How knowing yourself can help you navigate dating, hookups, and love. First, I'm curious, how did you come up with the title?
Publishers and editors are great at coming up with these kinds of things. So I can't take full credit for that, unfortunately. But we really wanted to make sure that we were letting people know that it involves thought, right? It's not just something that just happens. Like, you actually have to think about things. You have to be intentional. You have to get to know yourself and other people. So that's sort of the thinking part. And then the rest is, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just talking about, getting in a relationship and finding your committed partner. Like, these are skills that really are about an approach to one's relational life, right? Not just like, how do you find the right partner and then, get married or something like that. But how do you approach your entire relational life? What skills do you want to bring there that are going to help you navigate whatever situation you find yourself in, whatever situation you want to be in? Not everybody wants the same thing. So, the relationship world has traditionally been focused on, well, years ago, it was focused on marriage. That was it. And on heterosexual marriage. End of story. That was how you studied relationships. That's who you were speaking to when you talked about relationships. And over time, that's changed, fortunately. We've realized as scholars, and I think, the public has realized that relationships start much earlier than that. People start to think about relationships at a much earlier age. What people do leading up to choosing a partner really matters. And then people make all sorts of different choices and shouldn't have to be pigeonholed into making a particular choice, right? We want to help people just navigate and get what they want.
What I appreciate is, when we think about relationships, that are built, as you were talking about, on trust and respect. I mean, that's a foundation of, civil society and a functional, high-performing society, when everyone comes in a way in which it is bigger than you. And you wanna make sure not only that your needs are met, but everyone within your unit, within your group, your committee, whatever it is, they also have their needs met. So, can you talk a little bit about, how romance and the foundation of relationships is really the key to some of the civility issues that we're navigating right now, where people don't
Yeah.
feel like they need to have a relationship with others.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So the skills that I focus on, the skills that we talk about in the book and that I focus on in my research, there's three of them: insight, mutuality, and emotion regulation. And we've been talking about them in all of the conversations we've had so far today, right? Right now, you're talking about mutuality, I think,
Yes.
that people have to understand that it's not all about them.
Yes.
Right? Everybody's got needs, and we have to pay attention to those needs and understand them. And in relationships, we have to be motivated to want to meet others' needs as well as get our own needs met. Right? It can't be one or the other, or a relationship will not be healthy. And that's true of a romantic relationship, and that's true of many, many kinds of relationships where we're really being able to take somebody else's perspective, to empathize with them, is the way to make relationships go more smoothly. So that's a really important one. We've been talking about insight, right? Getting to know, right? Being able to see things, being intentional in your choices, being aware. And we've been talking about regulating emotions, right? We are talking about that just a few minutes ago, about how if you're angry, you just shoot that text out, that's it. Or put it on social media, it sticks, right? So being able to really regulate ourselves well is super important for relationships. And so this is the approach that I'm talking about. You can take those skills and use them to approach any kind of relational situation in a way that's going to help you navigate it in a healthier way.
So I'm sure a lot of it learned through reading your book. What I guess I'm trying to think, what are other ways that you learn the skills? Because I'm wondering, for example, you talked about maybe children who are a product of a divorced family. How much is it through either role models or your own observation of others in healthy or maybe unhealthy relationships to know what you're then looking for when you enter that space?
Yeah. A lot of it is observation. What uh, what we don't have when it's just observation is a way to help people know how to interpret what they're seeing. You know, it's easier, I think, fortunately, to know how to interpret the positive things, but it's much harder to know how to interpret things that are ambiguous or things that are problematic because they probably also look like they have some appropriateness too. So, arguing, for example, everybody fights. It's totally appropriate to have fights and arguments. It's the way it's done, right? And so, by just observing, young people in particular wouldn't necessarily know what to make of those kinds of things. So that's why I think we need a lot more information for people, a lot more direct instruction, so to speak. Um, I think it would be great if we could get, health classes in schools to talk about this kind of stuff. They talk about really important risk-related behaviors typically, but they're not talking about health-related behaviors, emotional related behaviors.
And Joanne, in a relationship, how do you get to the sense of knowing what, I guess maybe it's more your non-negotiables are? Obviously, you talk a little this compromise. You 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 mentioned about your needs being met and your partner's needs being met. But I'm wondering, how do you kind of work through that process when you may have a value set you're bringing to the relationship? And I guess I'm just trying to get a better sense of how do you walk through that process in from meeting somebody to then maybe have your first argument, and then how do you know the relationship's progressing in a way that it's actually something that you want to maintain and continue?
Yeah. I think there's a couple ways to think about that. One is that I think it's important to kind of coming back to what Judi was saying before, giving it some time and watching and observing what happens across time in different situations, how someone behaves. I think it's really important to know what some basic foundational things are that are important in relationships. And so one way that I talk with people about this is through the lens of safety, right? People, no matter what you're in, what kind of relationship or whatever you're doing, safety is foundational. And that could look differently for different kinds of folks and in different situations, but everybody needs to feel emotionally and physically safe in the end, right? And so I think that's a really critical thing for people to hold on to, because if you evaluate what's happening in a relationship against that, that gives you some sense. So if people are having arguments because somebody likes to spend time with their family and the other person doesn't want to spend as much time, and that's just maybe that could be worked out with a compromise. But if that turns into an argument where now the person is, being disrespectful, critical, dominating, something like that, now we start to go into maybe I don't feel so safe. There's something about how we're talking about this, not necessarily the content of what we're talking about, but something about how we're talking about that maybe isn't right. So really paying attention to those kinds of things, I think, is important. And figuring out, like, is this a person that I can be safe with over a long period of time, that in a way that's going to allow us to work out exactly those kinds of things. So that's one way to think about it.
And this may kind of be a continuation of that. And we think of like, we're in New York, it couldn't be a more multicultural, international melting pot of so many different cultures and perspectives and countries and so on, and religious and so on. Can you talk a little bit? And I heard your framing around the safety and the context and so on. What about when you're kind of navigating some cross-cultural conflicts? That there's a safety to that, but it's embedded in some real, cultural perspectives that, that you can navigate or you may not navigate, but can you talk a little bit about kind of navigating it from that intercultural perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, There's a lot of work these days on cultural humility.
Yes.
And I think, the cultural humility is also an approach. It's not a thing, right? It's not something we get good at. It's an approach that is about being open and, knowing yourself and examining yourself and being aware of your biases and being open to other people. I think it maps nicely on with things like insight, things like mutuality. So I think taking these kinds of approaches, having this sort of openness, self-awareness, self-examination, willingness to self-examine, willingness to listen and take perspective, I think these things go together. So I think that, the skills I'm talking about fit well in that cultural humility approach. And I think that's the way that people can work towards, understanding each other and navigating those kinds of real differences that can exist that need to be respectfully addressed.
And one follow-up real quick. That does take an incredible amount of mature self-awareness.
Yes.
And so for our listeners, like what are some of the things that you would make as recommendations for helping people really have those kind of deep dive understanding who they are? What are how would you coach somebody into like really mastering the humility piece to it, the authenticity piece to it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's effortful. It really is narrow. It's not something that just happens. People have to be willing and confront fears that they may have about looking inside. When I train therapists how to do these kinds of things, we talk about just, you need to think about your own experiences. What experiences did you have? What do you think you learned from those? What did they teach you? So it's about people questioning themselves in an open way. In the book, we have people do things like we list a bunch of like traits that they might have. We pick out what you think your traits are. Why are those your traits? Where did those traits come from? How do you think that helps you? How do you think that hurts you? So it really requires asking yourself some hard questions in an open way where I think we have to let go of any shame we might have about what our answers are going to be and about who we might be, and just let ourselves give ourselves the opportunity with compassion to see ourselves.
So, Joanne, what would you say to a listener who says they go on a lot of first dates but no second dates? What advice would you give in that space?
Well, first I'd want to know, are they the ones who are choosing not to go on the second dates, or is it the other person? Because the advice would totally differ.
Let's take both separately for a minute.
Yeah, well, if they're like, no, 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 well, it's possible that they might have really high standards, and so they might have to examine that. It's also possible that that's actually just the reality of the dating world right now, and you got to go on a lot of dates and just stick it out if you really want to meet somebody. If it's the other way, where people are not responding to them, then I think it's time to have a look and see, what am I doing? What's going on? What's happening? Have I picked people who really are not appropriate for me, and they know, that kind of, right? Like, that sort of thing. Or
They know before I know.
right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, or maybe there's something somebody's doing, maybe they're giving off a vibe that, that is, too much, too disconnected, right? That's, again, knowing yourself, coming back to the insight about yourself.
Well, great. Well, Joanne, we just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. Just what is a really fun conversation, and just wonderful job on the book and all the great insights you shared today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. We hope our listeners find these discussions informative and empowering as we navigate these times together. Thank you again for your incredible, valuable contributions. You've made us laugh, you've made us think, and you certainly have made us really unpack ourselves. So we were doing a little self awareness ourselves as we were talking. So with that,
We'll hope you join us again for next week's episode. For now, I'm Rick Gatteau.
and I'm Judi Brown Clarke. Thank you for tuning in.